right. If you were with us last week, you know we launched this campaign, and we're moving up towards December 8th, which is a day where we're inviting anyone who's part of our church, who've been part of our church for a bit, to actually participate in being part of this For the City campaign. Can you high-five your neighbor real quick and say, are you for the city? Can you do that? That wasn't very enthusiastic, but nonetheless, so glad you're able to do that with me. Now, over the next few weeks, we're actually going to be talking about something way bigger than this campaign. We're really going to be talking about your life, my life, and some of the themes around what does it look like for us. Last week, we talked about being rooted and being for the city. No matter how long we're going to be here, what does it look like for us to live this Christian ethic of living for the good of others? Now, if you're not a Christian here, I just want you to know this. Today's message is not for you. So you can tune out, check your phone, do whatever you want. If you're not a Christian here, that's not for you. But I would say if you are not a Christian today, you actually get a sneak peek into what Christians believe about kind of how are we to approach this thing called money, which is something that every single one of us, whether you're religious or you're not, we deal with from time to time. You get a special sneak peek at what do Christians believe about money and how we are to actually treat money. And now here's the thing, like one preacher once said that if the church talked about money as often as Jesus did, because Jesus talked about money, the top two categories or topics that he would talk about, number one was poverty, and number two was money. And one preacher he said, if I were to talk about money as often as Jesus did, no one would want to come to church anymore. Because here's the thing, even you're sitting here probably, and most of us are probably like starting to recoil at the very thought of like, okay, I don't want to listen to this, but I want you to stay with me because, again, I think there's some interesting insights about, again, a distinctly Christian approach to money. So in the story that we have today that was read earlier, there's this story of Jesus who teaches a parable. Now, parable is basically like a story that is supposed to illustrate spiritual truth. And there's this moment that comes then when Jesus is about to teach on this topic related to money. And I think it relates to us all. It's the story of us all. So as Sheena read earlier in Luke chapter 12, verse 16, this is what happens. It says, someone in the crowd said to him, this is Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." In other words, there's a money dispute that's happening within a family. This guy comes and he asks Jesus to do this. Now look at how Jesus responds. He says, Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them this, "Watch out. Be careful or be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Now, why does Jesus say this? He says this because here's this man who's basically coming with this money dispute, and Jesus can see right through it because he sees how this man is approaching money. He sees that it has to do with this insidious thing called greed. Now, look at what happens. Jesus told them this parable. Again, this spiritual story to illustrate truth. He says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest." Now, right there's a lot of information packed in just that one sentence because there's someone who's already rich. He's wealthy. And what happens is he yields an abundant harvest. Now, if he's rich and he's probably someone who's a farmer who owns a field of some sort, he yields an abundant harvest. Now, here's the thing. I don't know a whole lot about farming and agriculture, but one thing I do know is that when it comes to yielding an abundant harvest, a lot of the factors that contribute to an abundant harvest are things outside of a farmer's control. There's so much I can do to kind of set the landscape and do whatever needs to be done in a field. But I know that farming and abundant crops, oftentimes, it's dependent on things outside of my control, like the sun, like the rain and the weather and the climate, like the ecosystem and insects and all that, the critters around a farm. Actually, I have no idea. I'm just saying I don't know much about farming, but here's what I do know. I do know that there's a lot of factors outside of my control. And here's what this story is basically illustrating. There's a story then of a rich man who yields an abundant harvest. In other words, he's the beneficiary of many things outside of his own control. So he's already wealthy. Now check out what happens and look at how fascinating this story is. He thought to himself, "What shall I do?" He asks this question. I basically hit the gold rush on the stock market. Here I am. What shall I do? And look what he says. "I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Drink, eat, and be merry." Now, here's what's interesting about this, is that here's this man, he yields this harvest that he's so dependent on outside forces to actually provide for. There comes this moment where he's got all these big crops, and what he has to do is he says, here's what I'm going to tear down my barns, and I'm going to build bigger ones so that I can store the surplus grain there. Now, here's the thing. This very act of what he's doing, he's basically saying, I'm going to save for a rainy day. I'm going to put away the great blessing that I've been given for the future. Now, here's the thing. This whole idea of saving, because here's what this man is basically saying, is I've yielded this abundant crop, and therefore, here's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to build bigger barns and store this. I'm going to save it. I'm in a place now where this surplus has allowed me to have more margin in my life. Now, this idea of saving one's wealth or money, it's actually also very consistent with the teachings of Jesus and the wisdom literature of the Hebrew Scriptures. Because if you look in previous passages, for instance, in the book of Proverbs, which is about the wisdom, which is wisdom literature for all people, whether you're religious or you're not, check out what it says in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 11. Dishonest money dwindles away, but look at what the proverb says. But whoever gathers money little by little makes it grow. Now, this is a commentary on saving wealth, on investing wealth smartly. So in other words, the wisdom literature of that day, it actually corroborates what this man is doing. It's good to save money. It's good to save on the surplus that you've been given. Check out this in Proverbs 13:22. A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children. In other words, saving is actually a very admirable thing. It's a good thing for you to do this, to think of the future and the way that you accumulate generational wealth. But a sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous. Now, Luke 14:28, for which of you, desiring, this is Jesus teaching, desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, in other words, budgets wisely, whether he has enough to complete it. In other words, doesn't any wise person, this is what we do. We budget, we forecast, we save. Now, here's the thing. What this man does in the parable, when he's saving this money, it's absolutely consistent with the virtuous way that we're supposed to approach money. We're supposed to save. And so this man is really doing nothing wrong by saying this or doing this. In fact, he's espousing a manner of approaching wealth that's consistent with, whether you're a Christian or you're not, a wise way of stewarding money. So most of us, when it comes to money, the way that our culture works, and especially in the city that we live in, the story of New York is so centered around money. Whether you have a lot of it or whether you have a little of it, so much of the way our culture works when it comes to money is this. We're usually told to spend whatever you can. Live off of what you make your income, and then you spend, and then whatever you can save at the end, you save, and there you go. Now, the different ethic that the Christian manner of approaching money is, it's different because the orientation is different. It's not, hey, you spend first and then saving is an afterthought, but instead, it's actually different. It's actually save first, save and then spend. Now, here's the thing. Growing up from an immigrant context, I grew up in Los Angeles to immigrant parents who came here, and my father would constantly drill this story into me. I came here with $80 in my pocket, and I would walk barefoot in the snow to school. What are you going to do with your life, right? Like, that was the story. That was the controlling narrative of my life. And so this idea of saving was drilled into me. And I've told this story before, but when I was a kid growing up, there were these things called arcades. And the arcade was the only place where people would go to play video games. And so here's what would happen at arcades is that kids would have their birthday parties there and eat pizza and all that stuff. And so the parents of whoever the birthday boy or girl would be would always give out like 2 or 3 or 4 quarters to every kid who attended the party, right? And so what would happen is the kids would get these quarters. They'd be like, oh, yeah, thank you, Miss whoever or Mr. whoever. I'd get these quarters, and what would happen? They would receive these quarters, and they would scatter into the arcade in front of whatever arcade games they could play, whether it was Pac-Man or Galaga or Street Fighter. Some of you are like, I've never heard of these games. But this is what these kids would do, and this is what I would do. Now, here's the thing. It was so drilled into me, Drew, you need to save because we do not have money. So here's what would happen. At these birthday parties that I would go to, I'd get my 4 quarters, and then everyone would be scattering to their respective games, and I would basically get these 4 quarters. I'd be like, oh, yeah. And I'd put it in my pocket. And then the whole party, all I would do is I'd just be watching people play games. I'd be like, oh, wow, this is so cool. And then people would be like, Drew, are you going to play any games? I'm like, no, I'm okay. And then I would just have my hand in my pocket, just feeling the texture of these quarters, the coolness of them, and knowing that I could take this home and I just made money off of this birthday party. Like this was, now you got to understand, like this was my approach because saving was so drilled into me. And so this idea of saving before I spend, of having enough for a rainy day, this is like so in me. Like, and Tina will tell you, my wife will tell you, that whenever it comes to money, before spending anything, I'm like, hey, I don't think we need that. I think we can save that. When it comes to our kids, I don't think we need that. Maybe we can get something for free from the thrift store or from some other person at church that we can ask about it. Sorry if I've ever asked you for anything. I apologize in advance. But nonetheless, this is drilled into me, save. Now, what's great about that is that's actually very consistent with this biblical ethic related to money. But what's interesting is that this story and this parable, it's actually not about saving. In fact, there's an indictment that comes on this man. Now check out what happens in this parable. God said to him, "You fool! You fool. This very night, your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" Now, here's the story arc of what's happening. The story arc is Jesus tells this story. A rich man gets richer due to factors outside of his control. He starts thinking, I'll save this surplus and I'll eat, drink, and be merry. And what Jesus basically comes with is this moment of like, you fool, your life will be taken away from you. And here comes the spiritual punch that begins to rock this man's world. Jesus begins to teach about this idea that life and death have this clarifying effect on all of us. I mean, isn't it true? Whether you're a Christian or you're not, you've probably been in this circumstance where death has entered the picture or suffering and whatever that looks like. And it comes in all of a sudden, and all of a sudden you realize like, wow, are the things that I'm spending my time, energy, my money on, are they really that important? Have you ever had those moments? I remember after 9/11 happened here. And if you were around for 9/11, I mean, the city was incredibly solemn. It felt really awkward whether or not to laugh or to tell stories. Street performers were no longer in the city. Like sitting on the subway was eerily quiet for days. And it was because there was this solemn, just wondering, the city had undergone such incredible trauma. And for anyone that was living in this, it was incredibly harrowing to figure out, like, what am I supposed to do with this moment and my life? Now, during that time, the theater district, now for those of you who are in musical theater or you love musical theater, during that time, the musical theater and like the theater district completely shut down, if you recall. Shows were canceled. And the reason why was because entertainment itself felt like, I don't even know if we're allowed to be entertained during this time. The Yankees were in a pennant chase during that time in September, and they actually canceled these games. And the reason why was because there was this moment of like, it feels somewhat trivial to be watching baseball or to be talking about baseball in a moment of our city's great grief. Now, here's the thing, and this is not to say like the arts are not important, because they are significantly important. But what that moment showed us was that there was this incredible moment of when death comes into the picture. We all have this moment where we're reevaluating, what am I spending my time and energy and money on? I mean, have you ever had that moment before where someone close to you passed away? Or maybe you've been told that you've only got a certain amount of time while you've had this illness. And then what happens? All the priorities in your own life, all the ways in which your anxieties, your money, the things that you spend, all of those things begin to get reprioritized. And you start to figure out like, wait a minute, is this really what it's all about? I know that for me, I've had those moments. When my wife was sick and she was rushed to the ER in January, there was this moment of like, what are we doing with our time, our energy, our money? And this is what Jesus is pointing out in this parable. So even though this man is doing something virtuous by saving his money, look at what happens. Jesus basically says, you fool. And then he says this. He says, this is how it will be with whoever stores up for things for themselves. This is what it's going to be like. for anyone who's run this rat race, who's been in this city, who's approached money in such a manner in which they're storing up stuff for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Now, what is Jesus saying here? Because is he sinful for saving up and storing up grain? No, because that in itself is actually a very virtuous thing. Then what is this man erring in? What is Jesus trying to point out? What he's basically saying is that the orientation around money. You see, most of the world is perhaps spend and then you save a little bit. And maybe that's the way that you've approached the life that you live today in this city, is spend and then you save a little bit. And one way that we combat that is to save and then spend. And maybe you're like me from this immigrant background and this idea of like, oh, I have to save as much as I can for a rainy day because I never know if I'll have enough. And yet, here's what Jesus is basically teaching. The orientation related to money is radically different. It's actually you give first. You give. You're generous first. And then you save, and then you spend. Because the only way that the tentacles of money, the tentacles of control, the tentacles of our culture, which tells you that you won't have enough for a rainy day, the only way we can ever combat that is to give it away, is to be generous. To say to money, which continues to taunt us in this city. And doesn't money taunt you every single day in this city? Whether you have a little or whether you have a lot, the only way is to be rich towards God, is to be generous, is to give your money away. And so the order then from a Christian orientation is you give, and then you save, and then you spend. In fact, can we say that together? Give, save, spend. Let's do that again. Give, save, spend. In other words, what we initially do then is we live generously first, and then we save, and then we live off the rest. But here's the thing. So many of us, like even as I'm preaching this message, some of you are like, this message is so not for me because I am not a greedy person. In fact, I'm one of the most generous people I know. You know, what's fascinating is in this passage, one of the things that Jesus says is he says, watch out, be careful. Why does he say that? Why does he say, watch out for all kinds of greed? It's because many of us, we basically are like, I'm not that greedy. I'm not as greedy as those people in finance. I'm not as greedy as those people in whatever. And maybe you're in finance and you're like, listen, I'm in finance, but I'm not as greedy as my bosses. I mean, isn't it true though? This is what we do. We continue to explain away anything that has to do with money. And we tend to think of ourselves as being not greedy. In fact, we're generous people. And here's what I've come to know. Whether you have a lot of money or whether you have a lot or whether you have a little, every single one of us thinks that, oh, no, I'm not greedy compared to the other person. This is why Jesus is saying, watch out for it. Because greed is so insidious. It sneaks up on us, and it gets to a point where each one of us start to think, no, you don't understand. I'm a student, Drew, so this conversation does not apply to me. Or you know what? I'm a recent grad with student loans. This conversation does not apply to me. In fact, you're probably sitting here, and you're probably thinking of all the ways in which this conversation, this topic of money, does not apply to you or to me. We start to think, oh, that person's not as generous as I am. But the reality is what Jesus is basically saying is watch out for it. Be aware of all kinds of greed. Now, here's the thing. I know that even as we're in this conversation, some of you are like, this is kind of uncomfortable. Like, I didn't come to a church setting for someone to talk to me about money and to tell me that I wasn't being generous. When I am generous, right? Like, there's all sorts of ways in which we recoil at this message. And I know that I have the tendency to do this as well. Now, just to put my cards on the table, because I know that churches oftentimes have misused money, have been very distrustful for money. Some of you might be like, oh, Drew, the reason why you're preaching on this is because you want us to pay your salary, you know? And I just want you to know, and I've mentioned this before in previous settings, like my salary here at Hope Midtown is actually half of the normal salary of most Midtown pastors. I want you to know this. And I want you to know that one of the reasons why we can live that way, and the reason why I actually don't need your money and I don't want your money, is because my wife is independently wealthy. And I've been very open about that. Anyone who's come to our apartment, you've probably seen, you're like, whoa, Drew, you guys live in a nice apartment. Like, I just want you to know, my wife is independently wealthy, okay? So if you have any, like, there's any kind of sinister, like, you're basically accusing me of anything, like, I just want you to know, yeah, we're wealthy. And it's because of my wife. It's not because of me and what I make here. In fact, we give most of the money of our church away. So like, whatever kind of hang-ups that you and I might have about money and about church, I just want you to know, like, I don't need your money. In fact, even this sermon is not really even about you giving to Hope Midtown. I've said repeatedly when we talk about money, I would rather you gave, that you were generous from the start, without all the hang-ups of church or whatever. But the question is, are you giving before you save and before you spend? Now, some of you are like, that's too simplistic. There's also investing. Listen, I'm just trying to make things as simple as possible. Okay, are you generous? Without explaining yourself away, without saying like, oh, well, the money that I sort of have, I spend it when I take out my friends. Sometimes I'll pay for the tip and tax more than listen, there's a phrase that our culture has. Put your money where your, okay, no one knows this phrase. Come on, I know you know it. Put your money where your mouth is. Hey, money talks. Let's talk about your money. Let's talk about your budget. Let's talk about your income. Let's talk about your expenses. Now, I remember reading years ago, Donald Trump was once asked, like, how much money would you need to be content? And he said, about 10% more. Now, the same question was asked to a man on Smoky Mountain in the Philippines, which is this area, this incredibly destitute area of the poor in the Philippines. And this man on Smoky Mountain was asked, what would you need to make you feel content? And this man said, 10% more. If I only had 10% more. See, it doesn't matter how much money you make inside the human heart, and whether you're religious or you're not. And what Jesus is trying to get at, what he's trying to get at is the only way, because here's the thing, money taunts you and me every day in this city. It tells us you don't have enough. You don't have enough as this person. Man, how are you going to make it? How are you going to live here? How can you save whatever you can? You're only going to be here for a few more months. You're only going to be here for a few more, and this is what happens. Money taunts you and me. You don't have enough, or spend it on yourself. And there's all sorts of ways. Even right now, as I'm talking about, there's some of you are like, well, yeah, if I were to look at my money, I'm more generous than this person. Or hey, there's all sorts of ways. We're trying to explain it away. And what Jesus is basically saying, the only way to combat that story is to give your money away. It's to throw money back in the face of all those taunts and say, you've got nothing on me. You've got nothing. It's to give, then to save, and then to spend. And that's where the priorities are. Now, if you're not a Christian here and you're probably like, whoa, Christians, like this is how you're supposed, how come Christians then, how come they seem to treat money the same exact way that the rest of the culture does? And I'm here to tell you is because all of us, me included, I've got all sorts of fears and all sorts of ways in which money has its grip on me. As I remember moving to the city when I first moved here and I was raising support. I lived off of $7,500 my first year here. I was eating Wendy's 99-cent menu like every day and dollar pizza. I still do that today, but nonetheless, but you gotta understand, because it's like saving and being like incredibly like frugal, like that is part of my story and my heritage. And even now, as Tina and I, we're in a season where we're much more comfortable financially. It's weird. Those same fears that I had when I first moved to the city, and I was living off of a little, and I was trying to cut corners wherever I could financially, those same fears are in me related to money. Now the fears are, will my kids have enough? I don't want them to grow up the same way I did. I want them to grow up with more and for them to have more access to stuff. And it's interesting, the story of money and my own wrestling with money, it's still there. It never goes away. And this is why Jesus is saying, watch out, be careful against all sorts of greed. But you'll notice, why is Jesus on this guy's case? Because Jesus has already said, right? Like, if we've already concluded that saving is just as much a part of the Christian ethic, why is Jesus on this guy's case? You see, because Jesus actually reveals something in this parable that's much deeper than simply this conversation about where your money goes. Look at what Jesus says when it comes to this man, and look at how he teaches it. He says, he thought to himself when he's talking about this rich man, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And then I will store my surplus grain. And this is what it says. And I'll say to myself. Now, what's interesting about this phrase, I'll say to myself, is in the original language in the Greek, it says, I'll say to my soul. I'll say to my soul, soul, take it easy. Eat, drink, be merry. You've got this, soul. In other words, this is what Jesus is decrying. And the language of how he presents this story of the parable is this. See, what's happening for this rich man is basically saying, I'll say to my soul, because guess what? I control my destiny. I control my own future. I'm the one. And it's because of me and what I've done. And I get to be the one who's the arbiter of what happens in the future. You see, what's deeper than simply dollars and cents to this man is the condition of his heart. Of a heart that says, I'm the captain of my own soul. I am the commander of my own destiny. And Jesus is like, you fool. You fool. Don't you realize you're but a human being? And as much as you might try to convince yourself of how you have control over your own life, don't you realize that God is the one who controls it all? And this parable is brought up because the man in this story, his issue is he is his own God. He is his own commander. In other words, when it comes to his own money, towards his approach to saving and spending, it's basically like he's got his fist just clenched like this. He's saying, I'll say to my soul, soul, this is what I'll do because I am in control. And Jesus is like, no, you fool. You fool. Don't you realize your life will be taken from you? Don't you realize that you are not the commander of your own life? It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter how poor you are, how rich you are. You are not the commander of your destiny. And this is why Jesus says, give before anything. Because the only way, the tentacles of all the ways in which the culture around us tells us, hey, I don't know if you have enough money. Hey, you know what? You're still paying off loans. Hey, you're someone who, you don't have as much earning potential as these other people. Here's the story that you and we hear constantly is, oh, there's all these reasons why I should not be generous. So all these reasons why you know what? I'm not someone who's going to spend money on that. I'm not someone who's going to give generously because I'm not as rich as this person. I'm barely making it in the city. And here's what Jesus basically said, no, don't you understand? Every single one of us, doesn't matter how much money you have in the bank account, every single one of us. This is how we approach it. We're like this. We're like control freaks, and we think we know better. And the only way you can stare money in his face, you throw it back, you give it away. And you say, money, you've got nothing on me. I'm free. Now, the Apostle Paul, he says this, and anytime I talk about money, you'll probably hear me mention this passage because I love it. It's in his letter to the church in Philippi. Paul is in prison when he's writing this. And look at what he says. He says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I've learned to be content with whatever circumstance. Here's Paul. Basically, he's in prison. He's basically like, I know what it's like. I know what it's like to be in need. And guess what I've learned? I've learned what it means to be content in all circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Here's a man, and look at what he says. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now, what's Paul saying? He's basically saying, man, whether I have a little or whether I have a lot, I'm a free man. Free man. I can handle any situation. I can handle a lot. I can handle a little. Why? Because money does not have its tentacles in me. Because wealth, security, control does not have its tentacles in me. It doesn't. I'm a free person. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. Now, whether you're a Christian or you're not, wouldn't you agree? That kind of posture with money, to be so free from the trappings and the fears and anxieties and worries around money, especially in this town, isn't that what all of us long for? All of us long for that. To be free from those concerns, to be free of those worries. And that's the invitation to us. Now, where does this even come from? Because again, natural selection and secular humanism tells us a way of living that says, look out for yourself, look out for your own self-interest. In fact, exploit whatever you can to exploit those in need. Why in the world should we ever give generously? Why in the world should we ever sacrificially give away? Where does that ethic come from? Well, it comes from this Christian ideal. It comes from the very heart of God. You see, Paul would later write to the church in Rome, how will God, who did not spare his own son, the God of the universe, would give his son, his very life, for you all? And this is what Paul says. Here's the logic. How will he, who did not spare his own son, not freely give us all things? How will he not also want to take care of you and me? How will the God of the universe, who's got everything in his hands, who's created the entire universe and the cosmos and the trees and everything around the world, how will this God, he's shown you that he is for you, how will he not? Of course he will take care of you. Of course. But here's your part. Your part is, will you surrender? Will you just say, God, take the wheel. Do whatever you wish. Let me live into generosity first. Let me be ridiculously generous, unlike the city that we live in. You see, that compelling story only comes from a God who gave his life away and who tells you, I've got you. I've got you in my hands. And I invite you to live a life of freedom. I mean, isn't that the life that all of us would always long for? And that's the invitation to you and to me today. Will you be a person who's free from all that entangles us, all the taunts that money gives to us in this city? What would it look like for you to just be so free that you can say, no, I'm going to be generous first. I'm going to give my money away, something as tangible as money. I'm going to invite you to stand with me as we close our time together. Here's what I want you to do. I actually want you, if you can just hold out your hands, but I want you to hold it with like your fists tightly clenched. Yep, just like this. Now, obviously, today's sermon has really been about money and about how many of us approach our own money. And here's the thing. Many of us are probably like, I'm not like this. Come on. But I know that the human heart, what we're most inclined to is control. And just, can you feel the tension that perhaps some of you are feeling today? Maybe it is money. Maybe it's your future. Maybe it's your children. Maybe it's your health. Maybe it's your well-being. Maybe whatever it might be that you're holding on to. And this feeling of clenchedness is a feeling of, let's be honest, it's a feeling of your pride. It's my pride. It's my own kind of statement, like this man in the parable of saying like, hey, soul, this is what you can do. I'm the commander of my own fate. I'm the master of my own soul. And I want you to just, if you would join me in this moment of slowly opening your hands. Of letting go of the fears, the anxieties. And even with money, entrusting your life to God, the one who holds everything in his hands. Father, I pray that you would cut through would you cut through our hardened hearts? Would you cut through my explaining away all the reasons why I want to remain with clenched fists? And would you just release in us, over us today, a freedom that's only found in you, the one who owns it all, the one who has given us life, the one who tells us that when we give, we actually receive a freedom and a joy and a purposefulness that only comes from you. It's in Jesus' name we pray.